My parents disowned me for my brother. They didn't say it like that, of course. They used softer words, cleaner words, words that sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. They said I was independent. They said my brother needed more support. They said I would understand. One day I did understand, just not the way they expected. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone mowed their lawn on Saturdays and waved without really knowing each other. From the outside, my family looked stable. Married parents, 2 kids, holidays on schedule, college expectations already mapped out before high school ended. Inside the house, though there was a clear difference, my younger brother Daniel was the golden child. He didn't have to earn approval. It followed him naturally. If he messed up, it was because someone else distracted him. If I succeeded, it was because I was driven, said in a way that implied it wasn't entirely positive. When Daniel failed a math class, my parents hired a tutor. When I struggled once, they told me to figure it out. That pattern never changed. After college, things became clearer. Daniel moved back home temporarily. That temporary arrangement stretched into years. My parents covered his car insurance, his phone bill, his groceries. When he quit jobs, it was because the workplace didn't appreciate him. I worked full-time, paid my own rent, built a life quietly whenever I visited. The conversations were the same. You're doing fine. You don't need help. Daniel's just going through a phase. You're stronger than him. Strength, I learned, was just another word for neglect. The breaking point came when my parents decided to refinance their house. They needed a co-signer. They didn't ask Daniel. They asked me. They said it would be temporary. They said it was just paperwork. They said family helps family. I hesitated, not because I didn't care about them, but because something about the request felt wrong. I asked one simple question: what happens if something goes wrong? My mother smiled like I'd insulted her. That's such a negative way to think. That was my answer. I said no. That was the day I stopped being their daughter. The phone calls slowed. Invitations stopped coming. When I did hear from them, it was brief and cold. Holidays passed without plans. Birthdays were acknowledged with short texts. If at all, then my father said it out loud. If you can't be there for us, we have to prioritize the child who is. That sentence didn't hurt. It clarified. A year later, my parents formally changed their will. They didn't tell me directly. I found out through a relative who assumed I already knew. The house, the savings, everything, left to Daniel. I wasn't mentioned, not even symbolically. Disowned without the drama, Daniel called me afterward, his voice awkward but proud. I didn't ask for this, he said. He didn't refuse it either. I moved on, at least. That's what it looked like. I focused on my career, built a reputation for being reliable, calm, detail-oriented. I learned how contracts worked, how property laws worked, how estate planning worked. I didn't plan revenge. I prepared for inevitability. 5 years later, my father suffered a stroke. It wasn't fatal, but it changed everything. Medical bills piled up. My mother struggled to manage care. Daniel panicked. He still lived at home, still worked part-time, still depended on them for everything. Suddenly, independence wasn't such a virtue anymore. My phone rang for the first time in months. My mother's voice was softer than I remembered. She said they needed help. She said things were complicated. She said Daniel was overwhelmed. She said they needed me to come by and talk. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I agreed to meet. When I walked into that house, nothing had changed. Same furniture. Same framed photos. Same unspoken hierarchy. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, avoiding eye contact. My mother paced. My father watched me carefully, like he was measuring how much control he still had. They explained the situation. Medical debt, insurance gaps, power of attorney issues. The house was at risk. They needed someone responsible, someone organized, someone they could trust. They needed my signature. I didn't respond right away. I asked to see the paperwork. That surprised them. The documents were spread across the table. Medical authorization forms, financial disclosures, a revised will that named Daniel as sole heir, unchanged. They wanted my help without changing the terms, responsibility without recognition. They assumed I would agree after all. I was strong. I told them I'd review everything and get back to them. They looked relieved. They shouldn't have been over the next 2 weeks. I spoke to an attorney, quietly, thoroughly. I learned that my parents' estate plan had a problem, a significant one. Years earlier, they had taken out a loan using a portion of the house's equity. My name appeared in the early paperwork as a contingent beneficiary. From before the will was changed, they never updated everything correctly. The will said one thing, the legal structure said another. I went back. This time, I brought copies. We sat at the same table. I explained, calmly, that I couldn't sign anything unless the estate plan was revised to reflect equal responsibility, equal authority, equal recognition. I wasn't asking for more than Daniel. I was asking for the same. My father frowned. My mother said I was being difficult. Daniel said nothing. I stood up. I said that without my signature, nothing moved forward. Not medical decisions, not refinancing, not asset protection. I wished them well and left. 3 days later, my phone rang again. This time, the tone was different. They agreed to revise the will, not out of fairness, out of necessity. Months later, when everything was finalized, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. My parents eventually passed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Time did what time always does. When the estate was settled, the house was sold. The assets were divided according to the revised documents. Daniel received his share. So did I. He didn't look at me during the final meeting. Didn't expect him to. People sometimes ask if I regret standing my ground, if I regret letting things go that far, if I regret not being the bigger person. Sooner, I don't, because being the bigger person is often just another way of saying, accept less. I accepted less once, never. Again, I didn't cut them off completely after that. People like to imagine revenge as a clean break. One final confrontation. One dramatic exit. That wasn't how it happened. Real life doesn't move that way. It drags, it circles back. It tests whether you've actually changed or if you're just reacting. After the will was revised, my parents treated me differently, but not better. They were careful with their words. Polite, almost formal, like I was no longer their daughter, but not quite a stranger either. Someone whose cooperation they needed to maintain. Someone whose silence had value. Daniel struggled with the change. For the first time in his life, he wasn't automatically centered. He had to explain himself, had to justify expenses, had to answer questions he'd never been asked before. Responsibility sat on him awkwardly, like a jacket that didn't fit. He resented me for it. I could tell by the way he avoided my eyes, by the tension in his shoulders when my name came up, by how he spoke faster, louder, as if volume could restore the hierarchy he'd lost. It didn't. My father recovered enough to come home, but he was never the same. He needed daily care, medication schedules, physical therapy. My mother was exhausted. The house, once controlled and rigid, became cluttered with medical equipment and unspoken fear. They leaned on me more than they admitted. I handled paperwork, coordinated appointments, spoke to insurance representatives who never seemed to give the same answer twice. I did it efficiently, without complaint, without affection, they noticed. One afternoon, my mother pulled me aside. She told me she wished things had been different. She said they hadn't meant to hurt me. She said they thought they were doing the right thing. I listened. I didn't correct her. I didn't comfort her either, because intent doesn't undo impact. And apologies that come after leverage isn't lost don't feel like apologies at all. They feel like negotiation. Daniel moved out 6 months later. He said he needed space, that he wanted to start fresh. My parents helped him with the security deposit. Old habits die slowly. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. When my father passed, the house felt emptier than I expected. Not sad, just quiet, like a long-held breath being released. My mother aged quickly after that. Grief softened her in ways time never had. She called more often, asked about my life, my work. Small, cautious bridges. Some days I answered warmly, some days I didn't. The final months were procedural, hospice care, legal checklists, notifications, the kind of tasks that don't allow much room for emotion. Daniel showed up occasionally, uncomfortable and unsure of his role. He wasn't cruel, just absent, like he'd always been. When my mother passed, there were no speeches, no dramatic reconciliations, just documents signed and boxes packed at the attorney's office. Everything was straightforward, no surprises, no last-minute changes. The revised will stood, assets were divided, accounts closed, the house sold. The numbers were clean, balanced, final. Daniel nodded through the meeting, said very little. When it was over, he stood quickly, muttered something about needing air, and left. That was the last time I saw him. People sometimes imagine that moments like that feel triumphant, like justice, ringing a bell loud enough for everyone to hear. It doesn't. It feels quiet. It feels like alignment. It feels like the absence of weight you didn't realize you were carrying. I used my share of the inheritance responsibly, paid off debt, invested, created security that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Stability is its own kind of peace. I changed my number a year later, not out of spite, out of closure. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that family betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes wrapped in praise, in expectations, in being told you're strong enough to need nothing. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge story isn't about destroying anyone. It's about refusing to stay small. My parents disowned me for my brother. They never expected they'd need me again. They were wrong, and I never had to raise my voice to prove it. The silence did all the work.